In this video, we're going to take a look at the basics of working with the diffuse material using Octane 308 for Cinema 4D. And for this video, I'm using the materials 01.c4d scene, which you can take a look at. And here's the scene right here. It's pretty simple. Let's go into the Octane menu and choose the Octane Live Viewer window. And I'll click on the Octane logo here, and we can see the scene. Scroll around in here, take a look at what's going on. It's a pretty simple scene. I have 4 spheres and then this sort of sci-fi architectural object back here in the background, and a ground plane, and some really basic lighting, just environment lighting. On the spheres here, I have different materials applied. So I have a diffuse, a glossy, a specular, and a metallic material applied to these spheres. On the sci-fi piece here, this little bar machine from the Space Cantina, I have a mixed material applied, and then I have a basic diffuse material on the ground plane here. So pretty simple overall. Let's take a look at the node editor. So I'll go to Materials, Node Editor, and let's create a new diffuse material, and I'm going to apply it to the bar machine here. So let's pause this for a second, move it off to the side. And I'll go into the Octane node editor and just click on Octane material, drag it over here into the editor, and we can take a look at its settings. Let's expand this a bit. So I want to go to the basic tab right here and set the material type to diffuse. Well, this is already the default material type, so that's already taken care of for us. So it is a diffuse material, and let's actually apply it to the bar machine group. So I'm going to select the big bar machine right here. That's this object back here. Right click over Octane material at the top here and choose apply to objects. And it's going to apply it to that object in the group. So we go in here, unpause it, and let's redo a render. We'll see that now we have a diffuse material applied to this bar machine. So as I edit this, we can take a look at how it updates here in the live viewer. So let's take a look at this Octane material that we've created and applied to this bar machine right here. Let's rename the material. So I'm going to right click over this node, choose rename, and let's call it machine diffuse. Now all the channels of the material are organized into categories, which we can access by clicking on these buttons right here. So if we're in the basic section right here, we can set the material type. The default material type is diffuse. That's actually what we want in this case, so we'll just leave it at diffuse. And let's go over to the diffuse settings. So this determines how the light, when it's striking the surface, is reflected back into the environment. Diffuse materials, by default, of course, scatter light into the environment in all directions. So they're great for rough surfaces, such as things like concrete. They don't necessarily have a very strong specular highlight. Or you could think of also like eggshell or something like that. So diffuse material is great for those types of surfaces. So if we go into the diffuse options here, this is going to determine the color that gets reflected back into the environment in the diffuse channel. So if I start editing the color sliders here, you can see it changes the color of the surface. And I can also attach a texture to this node, and this will attach a Cinema 4D bitmap. Another way to create a texture is to click on this image texture node up here. Let's drag this into the node editor, and this is an Octane texture, which has a few additional settings that are helpful when working with Octane materials. So you can use either, but the Octane image texture is preferred. So I'll just drag a wire here to the diffuse channel, and then let's select on this texture right here and choose the file. Click on this button right here. I'm going to go into the textures folder for the project files, and I'm going to click on the bar machine textures and choose bar machine 1001 base color. So in this case, I'm going to choose no. It's asking me if I want to copy the image into the project directory. Since I'm just doing a quick demo here, I'm just going to choose no. And this will just put in the absolute path to that texture right here in the file field right there. So that's basically how you connect an image texture to the diffuse channel. pretty straightforward. We could do the same thing with the roughness channel. If I select on the material here and go over to the roughness category, again, we can choose to add a color or a value. In this case, you want to use a value. So you could either set this to HSV and change the value slider right here, or you could change the float slider. I'm going to rotate the view here to the side that's more strongly lit. You'll see the difference as I increase or decrease that value. So a higher roughness setting is going to cause the surface to reflect light in more different directions more intensely. So you get more intense colors there on the lit parts of the surface. And of course, as I mentioned, you can add a texture. So if you want to use an image texture for the roughness channel, let's create a new image texture. I'm going to select it, and in the options, I want to set the type to float. This is important because it will help to save VRAM, because it will interpret the image, whether it's a grayscale image or RGB image or whatever, it'll interpret it as a grayscale, and that will save a lot of VRAM when you're rendering. So textures take up a lot of memory space, so you want to be as efficient as possible when you use them. So I'll select this, and let's connect it to roughness, and then I'll select the image texture and find the file. I want to use big bar machine roughness. It's going to be a very subtle effect, I think, on this model. Let's choose no here, because I'm not going to connect. I'm not going to copy it to my project directory, but you can if you want. I'm just choosing not to in this case. So you can see not a huge difference right here. If I select the image itself, I can adjust the power, which is kind of like the strength or brightness of the image, as well as the gamma. And you can see adjusting the gamma does have a big effect on how the image looks when it's connected to the roughness channel. Let's get rid of that. And instead, I'm going to go over to the roughness channel, and let's just bring the value down to something like this. Let's take a look at adding a bump. So for the bump texture, I'm going to create another image texture. And again, I'm going to set the type to float. And I'm going to use that same roughness texture. I have a height texture in here, but it's way too subtle to be seen in the bump channel. So instead, I'm going to use the roughness image again. Let's choose roughness and connect this to bump. And let's zoom in a little bit so we can make things a bit more obvious. So there you go. We can see the effect of the bump right there. And I can use the power to decrease the strength of the bump. So if I bring this down to, say, 0.2, it's going to be really subtle. And you can actually go above a value 1 if you want. Let's go to, say, 0.3 or 6 or something like that. And you can also adjust the gamma, which will affect how the bump looks. And as we'll see later on, you can also add color correct nodes to have fine-tune the channel output of the image, as well as blend it with other images using a mix texture. That's the basics of using a bump texture within Octane diffuse material. Now, a normal map would work the same way, except you would create an image texture and you would leave this type to normal instead of float, because a normal map is an RGB image, right? Red, green, and blue. So then you would connect this to the normal input of the diffuse material. I don't have a normal map for this particular model. However, there is a video that will cover normal maps later on in this course, so you can check that out. But otherwise, very similar to adding a bump. It's just a different type of texture, and you'll get a different, in some cases, more accurate looking bump on your model, depending on the normal map and the model that you're using. So next, after normal, we have displacement. So displacement is similar to bump and normal in that it uses a texture to add detail to the surface of your model. However, unlike bump and normal, when you use a displacement map, it actually does push the vertices of the model inwards or outwards, depending on the light or dark areas of the displacement texture map, as opposed to bump and normal, which just kind of cheat creating the look of more detail in the surface without actually changing the geometry. So bump and normal basically just adjust the way that the light interacts with the surface of the geometry, whereas displacement moves the vertices inwards and outwards. We have a whole video that's devoted to working with displacement in Octane for Cinema 4D, but just briefly, the main difference between using displacement and bump or normal, you could just use a straight up image texture. For displacement, you had to first create a displacement node. Expand this a little bit, create a displacement node, and then connect this to the displacement channel. And then what you would do is you would add a texture to the displacement, to the input of the displacement. So if I use an image texture, this is probably going to make my model blow up, but we can give it a try. Go in here and let's set the type to float. And let's see if I choose the height texture. And then connect it to the input. You can see, yeah, it's kind of blowing up my surface here. So if I go to the displacement node, I can start to adjust the amount of displacement using this value right here. So this is probably not going to work great for this model because it's not really set up for displacement, but check out the displacement video as part of this course and you'll get more information on how to use it. That gives you a basic idea of the workflow though. So let's take a look at opacity. I'll click on the opacity button here to bring up the settings. We have a way to control the overall opacity of the surface by going to the opacity section and reducing this float value. And you can see it makes the object kind of disappear in the scene. If I set this to HSV, I can also use the value slider down here, either way. Or what makes more sense in many cases is to add a texture, because the main use of the opacity channel is for cutouts. So let's say you were working with a leaf and you wanted to have a nice kind of fine edge to the leaf, rather than modeling all the vertices of the leaf to kind of create that jagged edge. You could of course just use an alpha texture of the silhouette of an image, plug it into the opacity channel, and they don't have to worry about all that complex modeling. You can do it all with texture. So let's take an example here just using the checker texture. So I'm going to create a checker texture and let's plug it into opacity. And you see immediately parts of the model disappear. And the parts that are disappearing correspond to the black parts of the checks texture. Let's do this real quick. I'm going to select my checks texture here and choose UVW transform to create a transform node. And then I'll just reduce the scale. Now you can see that checker pattern becoming more apparent and even shows up in the shadow. That's the basic idea behind opacity. So let's get rid of these textures. And take a look at transmission. So I'm going to increase the value under the transmission settings. If I increase this, we get kind of a translucent effect, at least with the diffuse material. The transmission channel is going to behave differently when you're using, say, a specular material. In that case, it'll make it more transparent. But with the diffuse material, you get this kind of paper-like translucency that's kind of cool. So if I change that value, you can see I can make it stronger or more subtle. And of course, you could also use a texture. Let's take a look at emission. So if I go to the emission section, I have two options here, black body or texture. Either way, it's going to turn the surface into a light emitting surface. So let's click on black body emission, and you can see that the surface goes white and it's also casting white light into the scene. I'll select on the black body emission node. If I turn on surface brightness, then the size of the surface affects the amount of light that it casts into the scene. I can, of course, reduce or increase the power. It's kind of like the overall dimmer switch on the emission in the surface. And then if you want to change the color, you can use the temperature. So if I bring the temperature down, we're going to get warmer colors. As I bring it up, we get cooler colors. So I'm going to delete this. And if we go back in here and back to emission, and if I choose texture emission, then rather using temperature, I'm going to use power, just like we did with the black body emission, and surface brightness. Many of the settings are very similar, but I could also use texture for either the texture channel or distribution. And again, we'll have a video that covers creating emissive surfaces in more detail later on in the course, including how to use IES textures to create realistic lighting effects. Let's go back to our diffuse material and take a look at medium. So medium is a way in which you can create subsurface scattering effects or volume effects, like light streaming through dust or clouds or things like that. And we'll have a video that goes into more detail about working with medium and diffuse materials later on in the course. So let's take a look at the settings under common. One of the more interesting settings is shadow catcher. This is great when you're compositing the image with other elements, either rendered or live action. This allows you to use the surface as a way to catch shadows that only appear in the alpha channel. So if I turn on shadow catcher, we see our object disappears, which is kind of strange. Let's turn this off for a second. I'm going to select a sphere. Select the sphere right here. Let's move it up in such a way that it casts shadows onto our object. This will make it more obvious. Let's see what's going on. There we go. A nice shadow going across the front. So let's go back into our diffuse machine material or machine diffuse material. Turn on shadow catcher. Again, we don't see much. So let's go into the Octane settings. So go to Octane settings. Take a look at the settings for the kernel. If I turn on alpha channel, now we can actually see that shadow cast by the sphere onto the surface. If I turn off alpha shadows, we can see the shadows self-cast by the surface as well as the shadows here in the floor plane. So you render this out with an alpha channel, and you'll have this available for compositing, which is pretty useful. Let's turn shadow catcher off and also turn off alpha channel so you can see the background. Let's move this down. I'm going to zoom in on this a little bit. So we can take a look at the other settings under common. So we have smooth, which basically is not immediately obvious on this particular object, but it smooths the normals. So you can see right here on some of these rounded bits, if I have smooth on, we have a nice smooth kind of quality to it. If I turn it off, we can see the facets of the polygons. So it smooths the normals for that, which is useful. And then we also have a rounded edge radius, which adds a bevel to the surface in the render, so you don't necessarily have to add it in the geometry. So it could save you a bit of modeling and also save on polygon count if the bevel is meant to be subtle. So if I set this to 0.01 centimeters, you can see this edge here becomes brighter. If I set this to 0.1, it starts to not look quite as good depending on the surface if you raise it too high. But if you have it nice and low, it can add a very subtle kind of bevel to the edge, which can help to increase the realism of the surface so you don't have those telltale perfect CG corners. If I set this back to 0, you can see you have a perfect corner right here, and the transition doesn't look as natural. So that's what rounded corners do. And then under editor, these basically control how the preview updates. If I turn this off, then the preview doesn't necessarily update as I change the settings on the material here in the node editor. And then under assign, you can see the objects that this material is assigned to. So that's the basics of working with the diffuse material. In the next video, we'll take a look at the glossy material.